Some towns are built by the West and others are broken by it. But Sorrow Creek, Colorado, it was both. Back in 1869, this was a boomtown, born from the promise of silver nestled high in the mountains above. That promise was potent enough to draw 300 men, with their families in tow, into this very valley. They came with dreams of striking it rich, and with those dreams, they built a life. A proper main street took shape, a church steeple reached for the sky, a schoolhouse echoed with the laughter of children, and a hotel welcomed weary travelers. They laid down the roots of a community, the ordinary architecture of a place that truly intended to last. They weren't just building a camp. They were building a home. But the mountain that gave so freely was about to take everything back. It happened on a Tuesday morning, March of 1871. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to warm the valley floor. At 7 o'clock sharp, the day shift, full of fathers, sons, and brothers, had just descended into the earth. Then, without warning, the world fell in on them. The mine, their very source of life, collapsed. 81 men were trapped deep within the mountain's unforgiving heart. The news hit the town like a physical blow. Panic turned to frantic, desperate action. For 4 long days and nights, rescue crews clawed at the rock and debris, their hopes dimming with every passing hour. They fought against the mountain, against time itself, fueled by the prayers of the women waiting above. In the end, they managed to pull 11 survivors from the rubble, blinking in the daylight, ghosts of the men they once were. But the other 70, they were still in the mountain. And it became painfully clear they would remain there, forever entombed in the silver veins they had come to seek. Before the collapse, Sorrow Creek was a bustling community of 300 souls. After, it was a town of 219, a place hollowed out by grief. Of those left, a staggering 161 were women and children. The landscape of the town had changed overnight, not just physically, but emotionally. The remaining men, those who had been on the night shift or had other duties that fateful morning, looked around at the silent mine and the faces of their friends' widows, and they saw no future. Within a week, they started to leave. They packed their meager belongings, their gazes fixed on the horizon, anywhere but here. There was nothing left to mine, they said. Nothing left to stay for. Or maybe the ghosts were just too loud. They left in a slow, steady trickle that soon became a stream, abandoning the town and the women they had once called neighbors and friends. By the time summer arrived in 1871, the exodus was nearly complete. Sorrow Creek's population had plummeted to just 143. Think about that. 143 people holding on in a valley of ghosts. And of that number, 138 were women and children. The only men who remained were 5 souls, either too old or too broken by life to make the journey out. One was the preacher, a man whose faith was now being tested in ways he could never have imagined. Another was the town doctor, his hands now tending to broken hearts more than broken bones. The rest were pioneers who had seen too many winters to start over. The rest of the world looked at Sorrow Creek and shook its head in pity. They saw a ghost town in the making, a dying community with no men, no industry, no hope. Newspapers wrote its obituary, calling it a tragic footnote in the story of the West, a place that would be reclaimed by the wilderness within a year, a place to be forgotten. But the world was wrong. The world had made a fatal miscalculation. Because in all its pity and its pronouncements of doom, it had not accounted for the women. These weren't just widows and daughters. These were survivors. They had faced the raw, brutal reality of the frontier and had not been broken. They looked at the town their husbands and fathers had built, and they refused to let it die. They saw not a graveyard but a legacy. The mine was closed, yes. The silver was gone. But the town, the school, the church, the homes filled with memories, those were still there. And they were worth fighting for. Led by a woman named Sarah McIntyre, the widow of the mine foreman, the women of Sorrow Creek did something extraordinary. They began to rebuild. Sarah, a woman with a spine of steel and a heart full of grit, rallied them together. She reminded them that they knew how to work, how to endure, how to create. They had managed households, raised children, tended gardens, and supported their men through hardship. Now, they would support each other. They took over the abandoned jobs. They learned to work the sawmill, felling timber to repair the buildings that had fallen into neglect. They took up blacksmithing, their hands, once soft from kneading dough, now strong from hammering hot iron. They hunted in the mountains, their aim becoming as true as any man's. They reopened the general store, pooling their resources to stock the shelves. The hotel, once empty, was cleaned and polished, ready to welcome a new kind of visitor. The women transformed Sorrow Creek. They turned their shared grief into a shared purpose. The town was no longer a mining settlement. It was something new, something the world had never seen before, a community run entirely by women. They created a cooperative, sharing the labor and the profits. The schoolhouse, which the departing men had declared a lost cause, was not only kept open but expanded. These women were determined that their children would have a future built on education and resilience, not just the fleeting promise of silver. Word began to spread. Not of a dying town, but of a town reborn. Travelers, initially curious, would pass through and be astonished. They expected to find a desolate, sorrowful place. Instead, they found a thriving, meticulously kept community. They found women who were not just surviving, but flourishing. They found strength, innovation, and an unbreakable spirit of cooperation. Sorrow Creek became a beacon, a safe haven. Other women, widowed, abandoned, or simply seeking a life of their own, began to hear the stories. They started to arrive one by one, then in small groups. They came seeking a place where they would be judged not by their marital status, but by their character and their willingness to work. They found a sisterhood in the valley of Sorrow Creek. The town that the West had tried to break became a testament to what happens when you underestimate the power of community, and most of all, the strength of its women. They didn't just save a dying town. They built a new world from its ashes, proving that the most valuable resource wasn't the silver in the mountain, but the iron in their souls. Sorrow Creek survived, not as a memory of what was lost, but as a living monument to what was found when all hope seemed gone. Their names matter, so we will say them. Ruth Calloway, 38, schoolteacher, wife of Daniel Calloway, who had been shift foreman. Beatrice Marsh, 44, ran the hotel, wife of George Marsh, who had trained his replacement the week before he died. Clara Voss, 29, doctor's wife, who had watched her husband work long enough to know more medicine than she had ever been given credit for. Nora Chun, 35, wife of William Chun, who had come from San Francisco and brought his family because he went nowhere without them. And Mae Holt, 62, the oldest woman in Sorrow Creek, who had buried a husband in Missouri and a son in the war and had come west because there was nothing left behind her. These 5 women met in Beatrice Marsh's hotel on the first Monday after the last of the leading men had gone. Mae Holt spoke first, because Mae Holt always spoke first. She said, "We have a school and a hotel and a general store and a church and 200 head of cattle on the east, pasture that nobody has claimed. We have a well that has not run dry in 2 years. We have children who need feeding and educating and protecting, and we have each other. I am not leaving." One by one, the other 4 said the same, and so the work began. Ruth Calloway, the schoolteacher, reopened the schoolhouse doors. The laughter and lessons of children once again filled the dusty air, a promise of a future for Sorrow Creek. Beatrice Marsh kept the hotel open, its lobby and dining room becoming the town's beating heart. It was the central hub, the meeting place, the spot where news was shared and plans were made over coffee and stew. It was the center of everything. Meanwhile, Clara Voss, the doctor's wife, quietly transformed a small room into a clinic. Drawing on the years of observation at her husband's side, she began to do what he had done. She set bones, stitched wounds, and dispensed remedies. She did it all without asking for permission, because there were children who needed medicine and people who needed care, and she knew how to give it. Then there was Nora Chun. No one expected it, but Nora, the woman from the big city of San Francisco, had a secret. She had grown up on a sprawling ranch in California. With a confidence that surprised everyone, she organized the 200 head of unclaimed cattle. She managed the herd, planned for the winter feed, and taught others the rhythms of ranching. Her unexpected skills secured a vital source of food and trade for the town. And watching over it all was Mae Holt. At 62, she was the town's matriarch, its anchor. She watched everything and she remembered everything. She didn't hold a formal position, but she held the town together with the invisible, unspoken skill of someone who has survived enough to know what survival truly requires. She saw the small frictions before they grew into large conflicts. She offered quiet advice, a steadying presence. She was the glue. By the end of that first summer, against all odds, Sorrow Creek was still standing. The women hadn't just survived. They had laid the foundation for something new. They had proven that a community isn't just a place on a map, but a commitment people make to one another. The following spring, word of their resilience began to travel. 3 families arrived from the east, drawn by whispers of a town that refused to die. A town with open land, a functioning school, a dedicated healer, and a community that had chosen to remain. They were welcomed with open arms. The following spring, word of their resilience began to travel. 3 families arrived from the east, drawn by whispers of a town that refused to die. A town with open land, a functioning school, a dedicated healer, and a community that had chosen to remain. They were welcomed with open arms. Soon after, 2 more families arrived, seeking the same promise of a fresh start. They were more than just a collection of survivors. They were builders. They were creating a legacy, acre by acre, day by day. But trouble, as it often does, came riding in on the spring wind. The trouble arrived in the 3rd year, covering every acre of Sorrow Creek and the mountains that loomed above it. "New silver," he announced to the assembled women in the main street, his voice full of arrogance. "Deeper in the mountain." He looked at them not as the founders of a thriving community, but as squatters on his newfound fortune. He gave them his ultimatum: "You have 60 days to vacate." "New silver," he announced to the assembled women in the main street, his voice full of arrogance. "Deeper in the mountain." He looked at them not as the founders of a thriving community, but as squatters on his newfound fortune. He gave them his ultimatum: "You have 60 days to vacate." A silence fell over the street. The women looked at each other, the years of hard work, the births, the struggles, the small victories, all of it hanging in the balance. Then, a single figure stepped forward. It was Mae Holt. She stood on the porch of the hotel, her posture unyielding, her gaze as steady as the mountains themselves. She looked Gareth Doyle straight in the eye and spoke a single, powerful word. "No," Doyle, taken aback, sputtered. "I beg your pardon?" Mae Holt's voice was clear, carrying across the dusty street for all to hear. "We built this. We stayed when everyone else left. We are not going anywhere." Doyle sneered, his confidence returning. He was a man used to getting his way. Then wheeled his horse around and rode out, his men trailing behind him like shadows. The threat lingered in the air long after the sound of their hoofbeats had faded. But fear was quickly replaced by resolve. Mae Holt turned to the threat lingered in the air long after the sound of their hoofbeats had faded. But fear was quickly replaced by resolve. Mae Holt turned to the women gathered around her, her face a mask of determination. "Someone needs to ride to Denver," she declared. "We need a lawyer. A lawyer who is not afraid of Gareth Doyle." A hand went up in the crowd. It was Clara Voss, the quiet healer. Her voice was soft but steady. "I might know one." Mae Holt looked at Clara, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. There was no hesitation, no debate, there was only action. "Then go," Mae said. "The rest of us will be here when you get back." Clara Voss rode to Denver alone. The journey was 3 days each way, on a horse she hadn't pushed hard since her husband died. But she wasn't thinking about the distance, the long miles stretching out before her. Her mind was fixed on Sorrow Creek, the town she'd left behind. She thought about everything it had taken to build it from the ground up, the sweat and the struggle. He had used Mr. Price's services once and later declared him the most stubborn man he had ever encountered in a courtroom. Coming from her husband, that was the highest possible compliment, a testament to unshakable resolve. She was counting on that stubbornness now. In his quiet wood-paneled office, Edmund Price, coming from her husband, that was the highest possible compliment, a testament to unshakable resolve. She was counting on that stubbornness now. In his quiet wood-paneled office, Edmund Price listened. Clara spoke for 2 solid hours, pouring out the story of Sorrow Creek, of their lives, and of the threat posed by Gareth Doyle. Price listened without a single interruption, his gaze steady and focused. When she finally fell silent, he asked exactly 11 questions. They were sharp, precise, cutting to the very heart of the matter. Then, leaning back in his chair, he said, "Tell me about the original land grants." Clara told him everything she knew. She laid out the facts in the same methodical, organized way her husband had taught her, not through lessons but simply by example over the years. Price took meticulous notes, his pen scratching across the paper. "Doyle's claim," he said, looking up. "Do you have a copy?" Clara shook her head. "No," a simple, direct response. "I will get one," Price stated, his voice firm. "Go back to Sorrow Creek. Do not let anyone leave. And do not let Doyle or his men onto any property they do not currently occupy. A cold knot of fear tightened in Clara's stomach. "What if they try?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Price looked at her over the top of his notes, his eyes holding a surprising depth of understanding. "I suspect," he said slowly, "the women of Sorrow Creek have managed more difficult situations than Gareth Doyle." A spark of defiance ignited within Clara. She straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, "we have." The ride back was different. The exhaustion was still there, but it was overshadowed by a fragile, growing hope. She arrived back in Sorrow Creek on the 9th day since she'd left. And there, on the steps of the hotel, was Mae Holt. She was standing completely still, a figure of absolute certainty, as if she knew, without any doubt, that the thing she was waiting for was on its way. Clara dismounted, every bone in her body aching, and told Mae about her meeting with Price. She recounted his words, his instructions, his quiet confidence. Mae Holt listened, her expression unreadable, and when Clara was finished, she simply said, "Good." A moment of silence passed between them, thick with unspoken questions. Then Mae added, "Doyle came back on the 5th day." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" she asked, bracing herself. Mae Holt met her gaze, her eyes steady and clear. "We did not let him onto any property he did not currently occupy." She said it simply, without any further explanation, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And in that moment, looking at her friend's resolute face, Clara decided she didn't need to ask for any more details. She understood. The women of Sorrow Creek had managed. They always did. The fight wasn't over, but now they weren't fighting alone. They had the most stubborn lawyer in Denver on their side, and more importantly, And in that moment, looking at her friend's resolute face, Clara decided she didn't need to ask for any more details. She understood. The women of Sorrow Creek had managed. They always did. The fight wasn't over, but now they weren't fighting alone. They had the most stubborn lawyer in Denver on their side, and more importantly, they had each other. What really happened on that 5th day was this. A man named Doyle showed up with 6 of his men at the East Pasture, where Nora Chun's cattle were contentedly grazing. He rode up and told Nora that the pasture was his, under a new claim he'd filed. Nora, sitting tall on her horse, just looked down at him and said, "Show me the court order." Doyle, a little taken aback, replied, "I don't need one." But Nora was firm. "Yes, you do," she insisted. "This land is registered to the Sorrow Creek Community Trust. It's a document that Mae Holt, Ruth, Beatrice, Clara, and I all filed with the county land office back in the spring of 1872. You will need a court order to move anything here. Until you have one, I suggest you leave." Doyle glanced at his 6 men, then at the vast pasture, and finally back at Nora, still unwavering on her horse. He had the look of someone who had run through all the possible scenarios in his head and realized he was at a dead end for now. So he turned around and left. 2 weeks later, another man arrived. This was Edmund Price, a lawyer. He carried a big leather case full of papers, which he spread out across the large table in Beatrice's hotel. All the women gathered around as he began to explain the situation. Doyle's claim, he told them, was real, but only partially. He had legitimate mineral rights to the upper mountain, but that's where his claim ended. What he never had, and what he was trying to take, was the right to the town itself. The buildings, the pasture, the school, the hotel, the well, everything the women had poured their sweat and souls into building. The community trust, the document Nora had mentioned, had made it all crystal clear. The land beneath the town of Sorrow Creek belonged to the community, and it had been officially registered a full 14 months before Doyle ever purchased his mineral rights. Price looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each woman. "Mr. Doyle can mine his mountain," he said with authority. "He cannot touch your town." A wave of relief washed over the room, but Mae Holt, ever practical, asked the question on everyone's mind. "Can he make our lives difficult?" Price didn't sugarcoat it. "Almost certainly," he admitted. "He'll likely use legal irritations, little legal battles and challenges designed to exhaust you, hoping you'll give up and sell." He paused, wanting them to understand the road ahead. "I want to be honest about that." Mae Holt's response was immediate and resolute. "We have been exhausted before," she said, her voice steady. "We did not sell then either." A sense of determination filled the room. Edmund Price, seeing their resolve, closed his leather case. "My fee," he said, "will be whatever you can manage." But Clara stepped in, her pride evident. "Mr. Price," she said, We have 200 head of cattle, a hotel, a general store, a school, a medical practice, and a functioning community that is still growing. We can manage a fair fee." A small, appreciative smile touched the lawyer's lips. "I had a feeling you might," he said. On his last morning in Sorrow Creek, as he prepared to leave, Price stood in the main street with Mae Holt. He looked around, taking in the town they had built. "I have been a lawyer in Colorado for 30 years, he told her. "I've seen towns built, and I've seen towns destroyed. I have never seen anything quite like this." Mae Holt simply replied, "No, most people have not." With that, he rode out, leaving them to face what was coming. Mae Holt turned and looked down the main street of Sorrow Creek. It was still standing. It was still growing. She knew Gareth Doyle was coming. She knew his legal irritations were coming, but Mae Holt was 62 years old. She had buried a husband, a son, and 70 of her neighbors in a mountain collapse. She had taken what little remained and built this thriving community from the ashes. She could manage what was coming. They all could. She turned and went back inside. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And that was exactly how she liked it. The women of Sorrow Creek were ready for the fight, their spirits unbroken, their community stronger than ever. They had built this town with their own hands, and they weren't about to let anyone take it away. This story is a powerful reminder of what community, resilience, and a bit of legal paperwork can achieve. It's about standing your ground and protecting what you've built, no matter who tries to knock it down. Gareth Doyle was not a patient man, but he was persistent. In the 6 months after his legal ultimatum failed, Doyle launched an all-out assault on the town of Sorrow Creek. He filed a dispute over water rights, trying to cut the town supply by a third. But Ruth Calloway, one of the town's founding women, found the original water grant tucked away in her late husband's papers. With that, their lawyer, Edmund Price, had the dispute thrown out in just 3 weeks. Undeterred, Doyle hired men to block the main road into Sorrow Creek, claiming it crossed his mineral rights. This was a major blow, cutting off their primary supply route. But the women of Sorrow Creek were resourceful. Nora Chun discovered a secondary road through the East Valley. It added 2 hours to every trip, but it bypassed Doyle's blockade entirely. For 4 long months, they used that winding path without a single complaint, until Price legally forced the North Road open again. Next, Doyle tried a more direct approach. He went to 3 of the newer families in town, flashing cash and making generous offers for their properties. He thought money could buy what intimidation couldn't. He was wrong. All 3 families refused. 2 of them went straight to Mae Holt, the town's unofficial leader, and told her everything, what Doyle offered, and what they said in return. Mae Holt listened, thanked them, and made a note of it. She noted everything. By the winter of 1873, Doyle had spent a small fortune and had absolutely nothing to show for it. His silver mining operation on the mountain was struggling, producing far less than he'd expected. The mountain was tougher, the rock harder, and the hired men more expensive than his surveys had predicted. Doyle wasn't exactly failing, but he definitely wasn't winning. And for men like Gareth Doyle, not winning feels exactly like losing. So he started looking for a new kind of leverage. He thought he found it in the spring of 1874. A man named Arthur Blaine, a so-called territorial representative, arrived in Sorrow Creek. He was polite, well-dressed, and to Mae Holt, completely transparent. After just 4 minutes of conversation, she saw right through him. Blaine claimed he was conducting a survey of unincorporated communities for the territorial government. He mentioned a new policy being considered, one that could put all their land claims under review if the town was informally incorporated by the end of the year. Mae Holt listened to his thinly veiled threat without a flicker of expression. When he finished, she simply asked, "Mr. Blaine, who sent you?" He repeated, "The territorial government." Mae Holt pressed him. "And before the territorial government?" Blaine fell silent. Mae Holt didn't need an answer. She already knew. Gareth Doyle was behind this. She cut straight to the point. "We will incorporate," she declared. "How long does the process take?" Blaine, who had clearly expected resistance, seemed flustered by her efficiency. "Several months, typically," he stammered. "We will begin today," Mae said. "What do we need?" Blaine gave her the list of requirements, looking more uncomfortable by the minute. That very afternoon, Mae sent Ruth Calloway to Denver. 2 weeks later, Ruth returned not just with the necessary paperwork, but also with their lawyer, Edmund Price. He'd been anticipating a move like this for months and had already prepared most of the documents. The incorporation of Sorrow Creek was a whirlwind. In just 11 weeks, they had done it. The process required an election for a mayor, a town council, and a sheriff. The results were telling. Mae Holt was elected mayor by a landslide. Ruth Calloway, Beatrice Marsh, Nora Chun, and Clara Voss were all elected unanimously to the town council. The position of sheriff was a bit more complex. Two of the few men in town put their names forward. The town voted, and neither of them won. Instead, the people of Sorrow Creek elected a woman named Pearl Decker. Pearl had arrived 8 months earlier with her 2 children and a formidable reputation that preceded her from Wyoming. She was tall, direct, and completely at ease in difficult situations. Before moving south after her husband's death, she had served as a sheriff's deputy for 2 years. When offered the position, she accepted with the calm confidence of someone who had been expecting the question and had already decided her answer was yes. Gareth Doyle heard the news on a Thursday, the incorporation, the election, everything. The very next morning, he rode into Sorrow Creek, but he looked different this time, smaller. The swagger he'd had a year ago, when he gave the women 60 days to leave, was gone. It was like a fire that had been burning too long on too little fuel. He asked to see Mae Holt. She met him in the middle of the street. "You incorporated," he stated, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Yes," she replied. "You elected a mayor and a council and a sheriff?" "Yes," she said again. He looked defeated. "You are not going to make this easy." Mae Holt looked him straight in the eye. "Mr. Doyle," she said, her voice steady and clear. "A year ago, you rode into this town and gave us 60 days to leave. We did not leave. We have not left. We have grown. We have incorporated. We have a mayor and a council and a law and a lawyer and more families arriving every season." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I want to ask you something honestly. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" Doyle was silent. His gaze drifted past her, scanning the town he had tried so hard to break. He saw the main street, the hotel, the schoolhouse with children visible through the window. He saw the general store, the church, and the new homes on the east side that hadn't been there a year before. His eyes landed on Pearl Decker, the new sheriff, standing in the doorway of her office, watching him with a steady, professional gaze that promised she was ready for anything. Finally, he looked back at Mae Holt, 62 years old, standing defiant in the town she had built from grief and sheer refusal. A woman who had already lost the worst thing imaginable and had nothing left to fear. "I want to negotiate," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About what?" Mae asked. "The water rights," he said. "The road access. A formal agreement about the boundaries between my mineral claim and your town land. A legal arrangement that works for both sides." Mae Holt considered him for a long moment. "Edmund Price will be here next week," she said finally. "You can make your case to him. If your terms are fair, we will consider them." Doyle simply nodded, took one last look around the town, and rode away. After he was gone, Sheriff Pearl Decker came to stand beside Mae. "Do you trust him?" she asked. "No," Mae said without hesitation. "But I trust Edmund Price, and I trust what we have built here." She looked down the street of her thriving town. A man negotiating is a man who has decided he cannot win the other way. That is progress. They stood together in the main street of Sorrow Creek, Colorado, the town that refused to die. The town built by women who chose to stay when they could have left. The town that was still there, still growing, and still entirely itself. Thanks for watching. Have you ever wondered what it truly takes to build a community from scratch? Not just with bricks and mortar, but with sheer will, relentless negotiation, and an unbreakable spirit. Let's travel back in time to the spring of 1875, to a town called Sorrow Creek, and witness how a group of remarkable women carved a future out of the rugged Colorado landscape. The air in Beatrice Marsh's hotel was thick with tension. For 3 long weeks, a battle of wits had been waged across a wooden table. On one side sat Edmund Price, a lawyer with 30 years of experience etched into his patient but unyielding expression. His mission was simple: protect the interests of his clients, the women of Sorrow Creek. Across from him was Gareth Doyle, a man whose ambitions clashed with the town's very existence, flanked by his own legal counsel. And at the head of the table, a silent but powerful presence, was Mae Holt. She didn't need to say much. Her being there, her steady gaze, her unwavering resolve, it was an argument in itself. She was the living embodiment of Sorrow Creek's determination to survive and thrive. This wasn't just a negotiation over land and water. It was a fight for the soul of their community. The process was painstaking. Edmund Price, methodical and precise, dissected every single point. He was a master of his craft, ensuring that not a single inch of what belonged to Sorrow Creek was given away. Mae watched, her silence a testament to her trust in Price and her own deep understanding of the stakes. This wasn't about winning a victory, it was about securing a future. Finally, after weeks of back and forth, they reached an agreement. It wasn't designed to be generous to Gareth Doyle, it was designed to be fair. Doyle would keep his mineral rights on the upper mountain and gain a formal road easement through the North Pass, a reasonable concession. But in exchange, he had to release all claims to the precious creek water, the lifeblood of the town. More importantly, he had to acknowledge in writing that the municipal boundaries of Sorrow Creek were legally established and binding. This was the linchpin. This was the town's legal armor. But a document is only as strong as the words it contains. Price, ever the perfectionist, reviewed every single word 4 times. He left nothing to chance. Mae Holt then took the document, her eyes scanning each line with the same intensity she brought to every challenge. She read it twice, ensuring it matched the spirit of their fight. Then it was passed to Ruth Calloway, the town's intellectual anchor. With a sharp mind, Ruth found one sentence, just one, that needed changing. It was a small detail, but in legal matters, small details can become massive loopholes. Price, without hesitation, made the change. Only then were they ready. The signing was a solemn affair. One by one, the leaders of Sorrow Creek put their names to the paper that secured their home. Gareth Doyle signed last. His face told the whole story, the expression of a man who knows he got the best deal he could, but also knows it's a far cry from the deal he truly wanted. He had been outmaneuvered, not by force, but by intelligence, unity, and an unbreakable will. That very afternoon he left. Doyle did come back over the years, periodically checking on his mining operation. He was civil. He stayed in his lane. He caused no more trouble. Now, the women of Sorrow Creek had a friendly debate about why. Was it the ironclad legal agreement that kept him in line? Or was it the sight of Pearl Decker, the formidable sheriff, standing silently in the doorway of her office every single time he rode into town? Her presence was a constant, quiet reminder of the new order. Mae Holt, ever the pragmatist, suspected it was a combination of both. The law on paper and the law in person. With the threat from Doyle neutralized, Sorrow Creek could finally breathe. And it didn't just breathe. It flourished. The spring of 1875 was a season of explosive growth. Word of this incredible town, built and defended by women, had spread like wildfire. It traveled across the plains and over the mountains, carried in letters and told in taverns. People started coming. 12 new families arrived, drawn by the promise of something different, something better. They came from as far as Missouri, Tennessee, and even Pennsylvania. What were they seeking? They had heard whispers of a place with a real school, a dedicated doctor, and a community that looked out for its own. They heard about available land and a town that had faced down every challenge the world could throw at it, and had chosen to remain. It was a story of resilience that resonated deep in the hearts of pioneers looking for a place to call home. This influx of new people meant the town had to grow to meet the need. The founding women, who had fought so hard for this moment, now turned their energies to building. Ruth Calloway, who ran the assistant to help teach the growing number of children. Clara, the town doctor, trained a bright young nurse named Hannah Briggs, expanding medical care for everyone. Nora, who managed the cattle operation, saw the opportunity and expanded it, hiring 3 new hands to manage the growing herd. And Beatrice Marsh, whose hotel had been the stage for that pivotal negotiation, knew it was time to build. She added 6 new rooms to accommodate the travelers and newcomers. But she didn't stop there. She added a beautiful dining room, a warm and welcoming space that quickly became the most popular gathering place in that entire part of Colorado. It was more than just a place to eat. It was the heart of the community, where stories were shared, friendships were forged, and the spirit of Sorrow Creek was renewed every single evening. From a tense negotiation in a small hotel room to a bustling, thriving community. The story of Sorrow Creek is a powerful reminder of what's possible when people unite with a common purpose. It shows that strength isn't just about physical power, but about intelligence, strategy, and the courage to stand your ground for what you believe in. The women of Sorrow Creek didn't just build a town. They built a legacy. A legacy of resilience, community, and the enduring power of the human spirit to create a home, no matter the odds. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to Sorrow Creek. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of histories, hidden figures, and incredible communities. Mae Holt turned 64 in the summer of 1875. The town gave her a party in the street. Every family, every child. Music and food, and that particular warmth of a community that has been through something together and knows the value of what it has. Mae Holt sat in a chair in the middle of it all and felt something she had not expected to feel at 64. Not contentment, exactly. Something more like completion. The sense of a thing built to the point where it will continue without you. Which had always been the whole point. Ruth Calloway sat beside her, and they watched the children running between the tables in the lantern light. Ruth said, "Do you remember the first Monday?" Mae Holt said, "I remember everything." Ruth said, "You said we had each other." Mae Holt said, "We did." Ruth said, "We still do." Mae Holt said, "We did good work." Then she added, "Daniel would have been proud of you." Ruth said, "William would have been proud of Nora." Mae Holt said, "George would have been proud of Beatrice." Ruth said, "And your husband." Mae Holt thought about the husband she had buried back in Missouri and said, "He always said I was too stubborn to fail." She paused. "He meant it as a warning." Ruth laughed. Mae Holt laughed too. They sat together in the lantern light while the town they had built moved around them, alive and warm and entirely real. By 1880, Sorrow Creek had 412 residents, a proper school with 3 teachers, a hospital Clara Voss had designed herself, a newspaper started by a woman named Grace Elliott, who arrived with a printing press and opinions she was not shy about sharing, a church rebuilt in stone, because Beatrice had decided the original wooden one was not permanent enough for a permanent town, and a cemetery on the West Hill where the names of the 70 men who had not come out of the mountain were carved in granite, where their families came on the anniversary every year. Not only to grieve, but to stand in the place where the worst thing had happened, and look down at the town below, and know that something had been built from it. Something real. Something that lasted. Something the worst thing had not been able to stop. Mae Holt is buried on that hill. She lived to be 71. She is remembered in Sorrow Creek with a school, the Mae Holt School for girls and boys, which Ruth Calloway insisted on, and the town agreed to immediately and without debate, because there are some names that belong on the things that last. And Mae Holt's name belonged on the thing that taught the children. Because teaching the children was what she had always said was the whole point. You build so they can build after you. That is the whole point. That is always the whole point. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most powerful thing in the world is not a gun, or a land claim, or a legal document. It is a group of people who have decided not to leave. Subscribe and turn on the bell for a new Western story every single week. Leave a comment and tell us which woman of Sorrow Creek moved you the most. Was it Mae Holt? Was it Ruth? Was it Nora on horseback telling Doyle to show her the court order? Was it Clara riding to Denver alone? We read every single comment. This channel exists because of you. God bless. We will see you in the next story.